I think I would supply the heading for the last section of Matthew, chapter 26 through 28, the triumphant conclusion. That's the note, I believe, that is actually struck in this final section of Matthew. After the last of Jesus' great speeches, which ends at chapter 25, the first gospel reaches its conclusion in an unbroken narration of Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. I think we need to take special note of the contrast that runs all through this section between apparent failure and defeat and humiliation, with the mockery that is heaped upon Jesus, and the humiliation in various ways, and by contrast, the dramatic reversal that is portrayed in the calm and dignified account of the resurrection, or at least the aftermath of the resurrection. We must remember that Matthew has twice given advance notice that the resurrection would be the great sign that vindicated the mission of Jesus, the great demonstration of his messiahship. First, back in chapter 12, verses 38 through 40, and then again in chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, when a sign was required by the Jews. The sign that Jesus gave them, and the only one he would give them, was the sign of Jonah. He would be in the heart of the earth 3 days. That would be the sign. The significance of the resurrection cannot be missed if we will compare it to this background of the apparent triumph of Jesus' enemies over him. Because the resurrection becomes the overturning of their verdict upon Jesus, and consequently the demonstration that he was all that he claimed to be. Now this section begins with an account of what happened 2 days before the Passover, chapter 26, verses 1 through 5. And you have two contrasting events put down just side by side. First, there is Jesus' announcement 2 days before the Passover of his death, which was to take place. Listen, and it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these words, he said unto his disciples, Ye know that after 2 days the Passover cometh, and the Son of Man is delivered up to be crucified. When you go back to Exodus chapter 11 and 12, you find the background with regard to the Passover feast. That annual festival goes back to the time when the firstborn of Israel was delivered, whereas the firstborn of the Egyptians were put to death. Ever after, that great event would be celebrated with this annual festival, the time when God passed over the firstborn of Israel. It was the time when he gave deliverance to Israel from Egyptian bondage. Then notice, along with this, the statement that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, in which he calls Christ our Passover. He is our Passover lamb who has been sacrificed. Well, Jesus asserts with all certainty that after 2 days the Passover comes, and that will be the time when he will be delivered up to be crucified. Now, alongside with that, we have the plot of the Sanhedrin, verses 3 through 5. Then were gathered together the chief priest and the elders of the people under the court of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they took counsel together that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. But they said, Not during the feast, lest a tumult arise among the people. So here are these officials of the highest court of the Jewish nation, and they gather together plan the death of Jesus. There's the determination made to kill him. It's no longer a question of whether, it's only a question of when and how it will be done. They recognize that subtlety will be required in any effort to arrest Jesus. That means it would have to be done with deceit, with cunning, with stealth, and not in a straightforward manner. And specifically in verse 5, they say, not during the feast. It cannot happen during the feast, lest a tumult arise among the people. Jews have gathered from all over for the Passover feast, as they did every year. And back in chapter 21, verses 8 through 11, when Jesus had entered the city, the multitudes had acknowledged him as the Christ, and they were excited over him, identifying him as a prophet. And in chapter 21, verse 46, we are told that that was the thing that restrained the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jews from doing anything about Jesus. They might have taken him, gotten rid of him in some way, but the people held him to be a prophet, and that was the thing that restrained the authorities from acting against Jesus. And so they said, not during the feast, which we're going to do it, but it'll not be during the feast, lest a tumult arise among the people. So we have that statement made by them set down in contrast to the statement of certainty that was made by Jesus in verse 2, when he says that after 2 days the Passover cometh, and the Son of Man is delivered up to be crucified. They say, in contrast to that, it can't take place during the festival or the feast, lest a tumult arise among the people. So Jesus knows, they do not. They plot, they plan, they use deceit, but they do not know what is going to happen. The one who knows what's going to happen is Jesus. And the thing we want to notice throughout the narration is that Jesus is the one in control, voluntarily carrying out a divine plan. This is not a matter that he is a victim of overpowering circumstances that he simply cannot control. He is the one in control. God is in control. It's a divine plan that is being carried out. The Sanhedrin, the other actors in this great drama, are just instruments of a divine purpose. But God is the one in control, carrying out his will. Jesus knows what will happen. They do not. Matthew puts right alongside this plot of the Sanhedrin the anointing of Jesus in Bethany on the part of this woman who is named in John's account of this. In John chapter 12, we see that this is Mary, the sister of Martha, the sister of Lazarus, and the friend of Jesus. He had been in their house before. It's called here the house of Simon the leper, and we're not sure about him. He may have been the father and may have even been dead by now. But this occurred, this anointing, before the plot, before the announcement that Jesus had made in verses 1 and 2, that after 2 days the Passover comes and he would be crucified. In John chapter 12 and verse 1, it dates this event as being 6 days before Passover. And so that means in time it came before the events of verses 1 through 5. So it's put here for topical reasons, because of the subject matter, rather than for chronological reasons. And so the result is that there's a contrast between this act of devotion on the part of Mary and the hatred and treachery that come before in the plotting of the Sanhedrin and the betrayal of Judas that follows in verses 14 through 16. the anointing, this act of Mary, comes right between those two things. The woman's act of devotion is described in verses 6 and 7. Now, when Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster cruse of exceeding precious ointment, and she poured it upon his head as he sat at meat, or as the margin says, as he reclined at meat. Jesus had enemies who hated him. They hated him enough to kill him. They were plotting against his life. But this woman loved him. And she loved him so much that she would do anything for him. She would give him anything she had. It says she had an alabaster cruse of exceeding precious ointment. The Greek for alabaster cruse is defined in Arndt and Gingrich's lexicon as meaning first alabaster and then an alabaster flask for ointment, a vessel with a rather long neck which was broken off when the contents were used. This was valuable material, and the container would have been valuable as well. So when the time came that it be used, you just snapped off the neck of it. And Mark's account in chapter 14, verse 3, says she broke the cruse. And it released then this exceeding precious ointment. I don't know what impression you get from the word ointment. It sounds more like a salve or some oily, greasy substance. But that's misleading. It's a perfume is what is referred to here. And when the flask is opened and Mary pours this out on Jesus, John's account, chapter 12, verses 3 and the latter part of verse 3, says that the odor just filled the house. So this was a perfume. It was exceedingly precious. In fact, in John's account, when the disciples speculate how much it was worth, they say it could be sold for 300 shillings or 300 denarii. Now in Matthew chapter 20 and verse 2, a denarii was the day's wages that the owner of the vineyard agreed to pay a laborer for a day's work. So we're talking here then about a year's wages for a laborer. And she just pours it out over him, just lavishes it over his head, Matthew's account says. And in John 12:3 it says even his feet were anointed with this, and then she wiped it with her hair. So this is a love and a devotion to Christ that will just give anything, that does not ask how much the gift cost. It'll give anything. But the disciples were indignant, and their indignation is described in verses 8 and 9. But when the disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, "To what purpose is this waste?" Can you imagine that? This waste. For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. John's account says that Judas was the first one to express himself in this way. This could have been sold for 300 denarii and given it to the poor. Well, John tells us that he was not interested in the poor. Judas was the keeper of the money bag and had been stealing money out of the bag that they kept for their necessities. Been stealing money out of it. So he was not interested in the poor, but he says this, it could have been sold and given to the poor. And then the other disciples, then, you know how these things happen in a group. They say, yeah, it could have been. And so they rebuke this woman. I think we ought to take a warning here to be careful of such thoughtlessness, that we be just dragged into something as the disciples were dragged into this thoughtless expression, and so come to appear more like the Sanhedrin that hated Jesus, and more like Judas who betrayed him, than like this woman who loved him so much that she would do just anything for him. But anyone who took this woman to task was going to have to deal with Jesus. And he makes a defense of her in verses 10 through 12. But Jesus, perceiving it, said unto them, Why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. The Greek for good is the word which means lovely or beautiful sometimes. The Greek kalos. A lovely work she has worked upon me. And he goes on to explain, For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always. They would have lots of opportunities to do good for the poor, but the fact of the business is, they did not realize it. But his death was just 1 week away, and they were running out of opportunities to do anything for him. But Mary was in tune. And as he goes on to explain in verse 12, For in that she poured this ointment upon my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. There's some who think that she really couldn't have had this in mind, that Jesus sees it as having this significance, but that this wasn't necessarily the idea that the woman, Mary, had in mind. I believe they're wrong. I wonder whether Jesus could have heaped such praise upon her as he does, and seen this as so significant, if the woman herself had not been in tune with the situation. So she was aware. After all, Jesus had been saying it over and over again, beginning from the time at Caesarea Philippi, that he had to go to Jerusalem and be crucified and raised from the dead. And then he had repeated it, and the disciples were so dull of hearing, and they were saddened when he said this, but they didn't understand. They wondered what he meant. But while the others were unthinking, and even on the night when he was arrested there in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter and James and John, they had not taken the warning of Jesus seriously. Peter had not taken him seriously when he warned him that he was going to betray him that very night. And so, instead of doing as Jesus did and using that time in the garden to prepare for what was to happen, they had not taken the warning seriously, and so they slept. And Jesus was prepared, but they were not. And so the others were unthinking. Could it be true that this woman alone really understood what the situation is, or was? It would not have been surprising. We've heard about this woman before, at least in Luke's account. In Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42, on another occasion when Jesus was visiting in the home of Mary and Martha, Martha was the one that was busy about the housework, and Mary was commended because she was taking advantage of the opportunity they had with Jesus in the house and sat at his feet and listened to his words. And she was highly commended by Jesus. She has chosen the good part, he says in answer to Martha. She has chosen the good part, and it'll not be taken away from her. So she was the one sitting at his feet, listening. Does that explain why now, when his death is so near, that out of all the disciples, she is the one who understands the situation and is ready to do such a wonderful thing? She does not know what the circumstances are going to be when he'll be put to death. It may be that she would not have an opportunity to prepare his body for burial. And so she grasps the opportunity that she has now and just gives him all that she can in this flask of perfume. And then Jesus makes one other statement about this deed in verse 13. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world, that also which this woman hath done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her. Well, this comes true even right now in our studies of the Gospel according to Matthew. As this woman is put into his record, and as we study this account of the good news of Christ, we look back upon this with more understanding than the apostles and others had at the time, and perhaps than they could have had with their state of mind anyway. And we look back upon it with more understanding, and we look back upon it as a grand act of devotion that this woman has performed. And so evermore, as it has been recorded in the Gospels, she is remembered for this grand act that she performs. And so it's placed in this context right between the plotting of the Sanhedrin and the treachery of Judas in betraying Jesus in the following verses. It's put right between those two things. And so this grand act of devotion toward Jesus is placed right here, even though it came at a different time previous to the plotting of the Sanhedrin. It is placed here because of the contrast that it makes. The devotion of this woman is over against the hatred and the treachery that is so much in contrast. Let me make just a few comments about Judas' bargain with the Jewish leaders. We read about that in chapter 26, verses 14 through 16. Judas was the solving of the Sanhedrin's problem. Back in chapter 26 and verse 5, they said, we can't take Jesus during the feast, lest a tumult arise from the people, among the people. But Judas solves that problem. When he comes to the Sanhedrin, it gives them a way of taking Jesus apart from the crowds and in a way that will not stir up a tumult among the people. So that's seems to be the main significance of this betrayal, that it solves the Sanhedrin's problem in that matter. The Sanhedrin had put out the word, according to John chapter 11 and verse 57, that anyone who knew where he was should reveal it to them. They wanted him. They wanted to take him. And so Judas likely would have heard about that, and he sees in it a way to work things to his own advantage. One of the things that keeps being repeated whenever it is mentioned that Judas betrayed Jesus is that he was one of the 12. That's just unbelievable. Think of how much pain that must have been to Jesus, that one of these trusted ones should be the one that betrayed him. A lot of discussion has been done about Judas's motive, but so far as the records are concerned, the only motive that is indicated is the desire for money. Judas goes to the chief priest with the idea of getting something out of it. What are you willing to give me, and I will deliver him unto you? Well, that must have been just incredible good fortune for the chief priest to have one of the apostles come to them with this offer. But Judas was out for money. In John 12, verse 6, it is pointed out that he had been stealing from the money bag. So this was his nature. He was a lover of money. What will you give me? Well, they weighed unto him 30 pieces of silver. That was not much money. He betrayed him for very little. Exodus 21 and verse 32 shows that it was the price of a slave that had to be paid for a slave that belonged to somebody else when that slave had been gored by an ox that belonged to you. And so that was the amount. It was the love of money. The great lesson, I think, that needs to have attention called to it here is the power of money. What the pursuit of money can do to a person, the power of it. We don't want to take the warnings of Jesus about money and the dangers that subjects us to lightly. Then, in verses 17 through 19, we read about the preparations for the Passover. It was on the first day of unleavened bread that the disciples came to Jesus, and they asked him, "Where wilt thou that we make ready for thee to eat the Passover?" In Exodus, the 12th chapter, we see that the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were connected together. The Passover would be eaten, the lamb would be killed and eaten on the first day, and then for 7 days the feast of unleavened bread was kept without any leaven. No yeast was to be even kept in the house. And so that's the festival that we're dealing with here. Where, they ask? Well, Jesus does not give them an address. He does not give them a description or directions to the place. But he says, "Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The teacher saith, My time is at hand. I keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples." Now in Mark's account, chapter 14, verses 12 through 16, he tells these two that he sends to prepare for the Passover that you will see a man carrying a pot of water, and you're to follow him to a certain house, and you're to tell the master of the house that the teacher is ready to keep the Passover, and he will make the place available to you. In other words, even the two who go and make the arrangements will not know where this place is until they get there. The place is kept a secret. The time is coming when Jesus will be betrayed, when he will suffer, but he will control matters. Nobody's going to be just breaking in on this keeping of the Passover festival, and the betrayal will only happen when Jesus permits it to happen. And so Judas will not know where the place is. Even the two who go to make the arrangements, they won't know where the place is until they get there. And so it's a secret, and Jesus will be the one in control. This is just another indication of this. He controls things, and when he dies, it is because he voluntarily yields to death. Evidently, Jesus had arranged with perhaps a disciple for a place to eat the Passover, and I think that's all that is involved in this. It seems rather mysterious, but probably we're just dealing with a situation in which Jesus had made a pre-arrangement with this man to use his upper room for the eating of the Passover. So verse 19 says, the disciples did as Jesus appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. During the eating of the meal, the Passover meal, verses 20 through 25 describes the startling announcement that Jesus makes. Now, when even was come, he was sitting at meat with the 12 disciples, and as they were eating, he said, Verily I say unto you that one of you shall betray me. That must have been a bombshell just dropped in their midst. One of you shall betray me. He had spoken of how he would be put to death just repeatedly, but now indicates that one of the 12 eating this meal with him would be the traitor. Well, it was a bombshell. Why does he do this? Why reveal this in advance? I think there may be more than one reason. There are two things that have been pointed out that relate to Judas and the effect of this on Judas. It seems to me that some of the explanations that Jesus makes here about the traitor, that he does everything he can to reach the heart of Judas. Judas, if he resists all of the appeals that will be made in these explanations that Jesus makes, will just be one of such black heart that there is no saving him. And so Jesus cares about Judas. He does everything he can to try to save him right up unto the end and to try to turn him away from that course. But the other thing, if Judas will not listen to these appeals, then this announcement is going to be something that's going to provoke him to immediate action. So Jesus means for it to happen. He means for the plot to be set in motion and to get this thing done. He is the one that controls everything, and this announcement is definitely going to provoke Judas to go ahead, because he must have been startled, wondering, what is Jesus going to do about this, and is he going to expose me? And no telling how many thoughts must have been racing through his mind, and certainly one of them must have been that if I'm going to do this at all, I've got to do it now. The plot is revealed. It is known. If I'm going to get this done, I'm going to have to do it right away. So it would have provoked him to immediate action. The response of the disciples is given in verse 22. It says, "And they were exceeding sorrowful, and began to say unto him, Everyone, is it I, Lord?" The Greek construction expects a negative answer. It's not I, is it, Lord? And yet they consider the question that it may have been themselves, and each one of them apparently does this. They don't think that they would betray the Lord. They believe they will be loyal to him. They love him, and they are devoted to him. And yet perhaps they think it may be possible that in some unintended way that they would betray him. And so they ask the question in this way. Jesus, in response, gives some explanations in verses 23 and 24. First, there is an identification of the traitor, not definitely and specifically, but just in terms of the character of the act, the treachery of the act involved. He answered and said, "He that dipped his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me." Well, that would refer to any one of them at certain portions of the Passover meal. But it would be a friend, one who had shared this feast, who had dipped his hand with me in the dish, taking the bread and getting the broth and eating it out of the common bowl. One who has done this shall betray me. So it's the treachery of the act that is being pointed out here. That surely is something that would weigh on the heart of each of the disciples, and perhaps especially intended to do what it could to reach the heart of Judas. And then in verse 24, another explanation. "The Son of Man goeth even as it is written of him." And what that is to do is to make it very clear to them that Jesus is not surprised by what happens, and it's not just a matter that he's overtaken by superior forces that are beyond his control, but that he goes as it is written of him. It's a divine purpose. This is the thing that has been predicted in the Old Testament. And so it ought not to be such a shock, and it ought not to be such a surprise. And it certainly shows that He has control, and that it's a divine purpose that is being carried out, and it is not a matter of superior power that he just falls victim to. So he goes as it is written of him. It'll be the fulfillment of a divine purpose, but he goes on with the next point. But woe unto that man through whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Good were it for that man if he had not been born. And so even though this was the carrying out of a divine purpose revealed in the Old Testament, still that does not lessen the responsibility and the guilt of the traitor. Woe unto that man. Good were it for that man if he had not been born. Well, then Judas reacts, and he is exposed in verse 25. And Judas, who betrayed him, answered and said, Is it I, Rabbi? Just as the others had said, It's not I, is it, Rabbi? And evidently, with everybody saying this, he has to try to do something to cover it up and not to be isolated from the others. So he asked, Is it I, Rabbi? He saith unto him, Thou hast said. And there's where the emphasis is. Thou hast said. And the force of that would be something like, It is as you say. And so he reveals it to Judas that he knows. He knows. And very soon then, Judas, John chapter 13, the parallel in John will make it clear that Judas is exposed, that he is, and he will realize that the Lord knows. And Judas is sent out into the night, and the Lord says, What you do quickly. Go ahead and get this thing done. And so, not authorizing it, not approving of it, but with Judas determined to do it, him telling him, Go ahead and do what you've got to do. And John says he went out, and it was night. The deed was matched by the time of day. Then, in verses 26 through 29, the institution of the Lord's Supper, or at least the comments that Jesus makes about the memorial emblems on this occasion. But this is the institution of what will later be referred to by Paul as the Lord's Supper. At one memorial feast, Jesus institutes another. The Passover itself was a memorial feast commemorating the deliverance from Egypt, and especially the deliverance from the firstborn. And you can read about that and learn the significance of it from Exodus chapter 12. But at one memorial feast, the Passover, Jesus institutes another. And yet, I want you to notice that nothing in Matthew indicates that something is being instituted here which will be repeated periodically. That this is a meal or a feast or supper to be repeated. Now in Luke there is an indication of that, in Luke 22:19, and in Paul's summary in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 24 and 25, when according to Paul, when Jesus said to eat, this is my body, and take this cup and drink it, he makes the statement, as oft as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. And so here is indication of something that is to be repeated and that it is to be done in remembrance of him. That would be the significance of it. But nothing of that appears in Matthew's account here. And so where does the focus of the emphasis here fall? I think we need to try to learn to read this passage not as something that we've heard so many times that we already have in our minds what it is, but we ought to read it as if we had not heard it before, and hear it as the disciples heard these words when they heard them for the first time. And I think the focus of the emphasis here will then be on the meaning and the significance of what was about to happen, the death of Jesus that was about to take place. He had said over and over again that he would have to die, but he had said very little about the meaning of it. He had said it was necessary, but I think only in the passage in chapter 20, verse 28, when he called his death a ransom for the many, only in that does he say anything about why he had to die and the meaning and the significance of it. But he does here. Here is a second passage in which we have information given about the significance of his death. First, notice this. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed and brake it, and he gave to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." They are to eat bread, which he says is my body. There's a sharing in his body that they will participate in. And then verse 27, and he took a cup and gave thanks and gave to them, saying, "Drink ye all of it. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many unto remission of sins." And so again, drink ye all of it. This is my blood. So they would have a share in his blood. There's a sharing that they would have in his body and in his blood. And so this is going to teach them something about the significance of the death on the cross that is about to occur. And then notice that he refers to the blood as being my blood of the covenant. That expression comes from Exodus chapter 24 and verse 8. When the first covenant was established, it was read to the people, and they agreed that they would do everything that they were commanded to do. And then Moses took the blood, and it was sprinkled on the people, sprinkled on the book, and later on sprinkled on the tabernacle and the vessels of ministry. But then he said, this is the blood of the covenant. It was the blood that put the covenant into effect and established the relationship between God and the people Israel. And now here Jesus says that this is my blood of the covenant. And I think this is clearly a reference to the new covenant. And that becomes clear when you realize that he's going on to speak of this blood as being connected with the remission of sins. Well, in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 34, God had promised that he would establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And he goes on to describe the nature of it. But at the end of the passage, he says, "And their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more." That will be a part of the provision of this new covenant. And so evidently Jeremiah 31 is also in the mind of Jesus here, where he says, "This is my blood of the covenant," and he gives the significance of it, which is poured out for many unto remission of sins. And he points out that his death, as it would be shed, would be given for the forgiveness of sins. And so here the real significance of this in Matthew is that he is explaining the significance of his death and of his shed blood. There's not really any indication that this is going to be something that they're going to repeat and repeat and repeat so far as Matthew's representation of it is concerned. We learn that from other places, but we learn here a great deal about the significance of the death of Jesus. Then in verse 29, he closes out by indicating to them that conditions are going to be changed from now on. "But I say unto you, I shall not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And so conditions were going to be changed. We find later he would be separated from them. He would not drink as he had done repeatedly in the past in this personal relationship with them. "I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And I think there we have to remember that he had often thought of the kingdom as being a great banquet. And so he thinks of the participation in that banquet, and I think this is the consummation of the kingdom that will take place at the end of time rather than in the church. Jesus does not drink the fruit of the vine in the church, but he will in that new age to come, and that seems to be what this is referring to, the new world, the kingdom being thought of in terms of a great banquet in which they would share. And then we are told when they had sung a hymn, they went out unto the Mount of Olives.